Mira awoke to the sterile hum of the Hexagon's artificial atmosphere. The faint vibrations of the space station reverberated through the metal bars of her enclosure, a constant reminder that she was miles away from any natural ground. She stretched her iridescent wings broad and luminous. They shimmered in hues of sapphire, emerald, and gold. To any observer, she was a masterpiece, a living gem trapped behind glass. The Zerothians, who had captured her during a raid on her homeworld, prided themselves on their collection of rare and beautiful creatures. To them, Mira wasn't a person, she was an exhibit. Her cage stood in the Hall of Rarities, flanked by other imprisoned beings, a scaled Lumador from the volcanic planet Drakhthin and a gelatinous Salvian, its form constantly shifting inside a containment tank. But Mira's cell was positioned in the center, the piece de resistance of the collection. Visitors from across the galaxy passed through the hall, admiring the captives and marveling at the Zerothians' power. Mira could hear their voices, muffled and distorted by the thick glass walls that separated her from them. "She's an aviolix," one voice remarked with awe. "I thought their kind was extinct." "Not extinct," another corrected. "Merely rare. The Zerothians are the only ones capable of acquiring such a prize." Mira stopped listening. Their words were daggers, cutting at her sense of self. To them, she was no more than a possession, a curiosity to be gawked at. Her world, her family were gone, destroyed in the very raid that had stolen her away. She didn't know if any of her people had survived. For all she knew, she was the last aviolix in existence. Her days followed a numbing routine. The lights in the hall would dim during simulated night, granting her a few hours of rest. Food was delivered through an automated chute bland paste that sustained her but provided no pleasure. There was nothing to do but pace the confines of her cage or perch on the solitary branch provided as a cruel mimicry of her native forests. She would close her eyes and imagine herself soaring through the skies of Aviolixia, the winds carrying her high above endless verdant canopies. But each time she opened her eyes, the reality of her confinement crashed back down on her. The walls of her cage seemed to close in, suffocating her. She had tried everything to escape clawing at the bars, attempting to bend the metal with the strength of her wings, but the Zerothians' technology was flawless. Her prison was inescapable. One day, as she sat at the base of her cage, feathers dull from exhaustion, a new sound pierced the monotony. It was deeper than the usual chatter of visitors, a voice that carried authority and purpose. Mira couldn't understand the words, but the tone intrigued her. Rising to her feet, she moved closer to the glass and peered out. Standing among the Zerothian guards was a figure unlike any she had seen before, a human. He was clad in sleek, dark armor that bore the insignia of the United Galactic Alliance, a coalition of species fighting for peace and justice in the cosmos. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate. Even through the barrier of her cage, Mira felt the weight of his gaze as he scanned the hall. "Who is he?" she wondered aloud, her voice a soft trill in her native tongue. The human stopped in front of her cage, his brow furrowing as he studied her. For a brief moment, their eyes met hers, filled with a lifetime of sorrow, his with something she couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Determination? Whatever it was, it stirred something in her, a flicker of hope she had long thought extinguished. As the human turned to leave, Mira pressed her hand against the glass, longing to call out to him but knowing it was futile. She watched as he disappeared into the corridors of the Hexagon, leaving her alone once more. But something was different now. The monotony of her despair had been disrupted, and the faint ember of hope began to smolder within her chest. She didn't know who the human was or why he had come, but for the first time in years, she dared to believe that her cage might not be her forever. And in that moment, she resolved to stay vigilant. For the first time, Mira thought, perhaps salvation isn't as far away as I believed. The Hexagon was an architectural marvel, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers orbiting a gas giant in the Zerothian quadrant. The space station was an intersection of politics and trade, hosting dignitaries, merchants, and warriors from across the galaxy. Captain Eli Drake had visited many such places during his service in the United Galactic Alliance, but the Hexalon felt different, tense, sinister. Eli walked through the polished halls with an air of casual authority. His dark, angular armor bore the emblem of the UGA, a symbol of peace and unity among allied species. He had come to the Hexalon to negotiate with the Zerothians, a notoriously proud and militaristic race whose expansionist ambitions had sparked numerous skirmishes across the galaxy. The mission was supposed to be simple: establish common ground, prevent further bloodshed. But Eli knew from experience that nothing with the Zerothians was ever simple. His comlink buzzed, and a familiar voice crackled in his ear. "Captain, you've got 15 minutes before the next meeting with the Zorothian Council." "Copy that," Eli replied. He turned a corner, his boots echoing against the metallic floor. His schedule was packed with formalities and diplomatic posturing, but he found himself drawn to a quieter part of the station. The Hall of Rarities. Eli entered the vast chamber and was immediately struck by its chilling atmosphere. Rows of cages and containment tanks lined the walls, each housing a being more extraordinary than the last. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, a sterile veneer masking the underlying cruelty. Eli had heard rumors of the Zerothians' collection, but seeing it in person turned his stomach. As he wandered through the hall, his eyes fell on a central cage, larger and more elaborate than the others. Inside, a figure sat with her back against the bars, her shimmering wings folded tightly around her body. She looked fragile yet radiant, her feathers catching the artificial light and refracting it into a spectrum of colors. Her gaze was distant, her expression weary. An aviolix, Eli realized. He had read about them in ancient archives, an elusive, peaceful race nearly wiped out by the Zerothians' relentless conquests. Seeing one alive, here of all places, filled him with a mixture of wonder and anger. Approaching the cage, Eli crouched to get a closer look. The aviolix stirred, sensing his presence. When she turned her head, their eyes met. Her pupils, dark and endless, seemed to peer into the depths of his soul. Eli felt a pang of guilt, as though he had intruded on something sacred. "She's our finest specimen," a voice interrupted. Eli straightened to see a Zorothian guard approaching, his reptilian features twisted into a smug grin. "Captured from the aviolix homeworld during the Great Expansion." "Magnificent, isn't she?" Eli's jaw tightened. "She's not a specimen. She's a sentient being." The guard's grin faltered, replaced by a wary frown. "Careful, human. The aviolix are a conquered race. Her presence here is an honor. Besides, your council sent you here to negotiate, not to question our ways." Eli said nothing, his fists clenching at his sides. The guard smirked and walked away, leaving him alone with the caged aviolix. Eli turned back to her, and for a moment, he let his guard down. He pressed a hand against the glass, silently apologizing for all the ways the galaxy had failed her. The aviolix rose slowly, her wings unfurling in a cascade of light. She stepped closer, her movements graceful despite her confinement. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and melodic, though Eli couldn't understand the words. His translator device struggled to catch up, spitting out a garbled interpretation. But he didn't need technology to understand what her eyes were saying. "Help me." Eli stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the weight of her plea. He thought of the consequences. Freeing her would mean jeopardizing his mission, risking an intergalactic incident. But leaving her behind would be worse. It would mean turning his back on everything he stood for. "I'll come back," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him, but hoping she would feel the conviction in his words. "I promise." As he left the Hall of Rarities, Eli's mind raced with plans. He would need stealth, precision, and a whole lot of luck. But one thing was certain, he couldn't let her remain a prisoner in that cage. The diplomat in him might have come to the Hexalon seeking peace, but the warrior in him had just found a new mission. The Hexalon was a fortress. Every corridor bristled with surveillance, every door sealed with biometric locks. But Captain Eli Drake wasn't a stranger to impossible odds. As he made his way back to his quarters, his mind worked tirelessly to craft a plan. He didn't have much time. By morning, the Zorothian Council would expect his report, and if Mira the Aviolix was missing by then, diplomacy would crumble. Eli sat at his desk and opened a holographic interface, calling up the Hexalon schematics. They were incomplete, just the public-facing layers of the station, but he had already memorized the guards' patrol routes in the Hall of Rarities. He would have to improvise the rest. His comlink buzzed. It was his second-in-command, Lieutenant Tessa Marlowe. "Captain, you're cutting it close. The Council expects us in 6 hours. "I know," Eli said, his voice low. "But I have a detour to make." Tessa hesitated. "A detour?" "Eli, what are you planning?" "There's someone here who doesn't belong in a cage," Eli replied. "I'm getting her out." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Tessa knew better than to argue. "If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Just don't get yourself killed. We need you alive to negotiate the peace." Eli disconnected and gathered his gear, a compact plasma cutter, an EMP device to disable security drones, and a neural disruptor for the guards. He donned his armor, its matte black finish designed for stealth, and slipped out of his quarters into the dimly lit corridors of the Hexalon. Mira sat in her cage, her wings folded tightly around her body. The artificial night cycle had begun, and the Hall of Rarities was eerily silent. She stared at the glass, replaying the human's visit in her mind. There had been something in his eyes, a flicker of defiance, a promise unspoken. Could he really help her? She dared not hope too much, lest the disappointment crush her completely. A faint noise pulled her from her thoughts. The sound of soft footfalls, almost imperceptible. Her heart quickened as she turned toward the source. A shadow moved among the cages, and then he appeared, Eli, the human warrior. He crouched beside her cage, his expression serious. "Mira," he whispered, his translator catching the tone of urgency in his voice. "I'm here to get you out." She blinked in disbelief, her feathers ruffling slightly. It wasn't until he activated the plasma cutter and began slicing through the metal bars that she realized this wasn't another dream. This was real. The plasma cutter emitted a faint hiss as it carved through the cage's alloy. Mira stepped back, watching with a mixture of awe and apprehension. When the final bar fell away, Eli extended a hand to her. She hesitated, then placed her delicate fingers in his, stepping out of the cage for the first time in years. "Stay close," Eli said, pulling out the EMP device. "We don't have much time." The escape began smoothly. Eli had timed the patrols perfectly, avoiding the guards and disabling the security cameras as they moved through the hall. Mira followed him silently, her light, graceful steps barely making a sound. But as they entered the main corridor, their luck ran out. A pair of Zorothian guards turned the corner, their reptilian eyes narrowing as they spotted the pair. One of them barked an alarm, drawing a weapon. "Run!" Eli shouted, shoving Mira ahead of him as he fired the neural disruptor. The guards crumpled to the ground, but the alarm had been triggered. Red lights bathed the corridor, and the sound of klaxons filled the air. They sprinted through the station, Eli taking out drones and guards with precision. Mira kept pace, her wings shimmering with every movement. For the first time in years, she felt alive, not just existing, but truly living. When they reached the docking bay, Eli's ship, the Starfire, loomed ahead like a beacon of salvation. Its engines were already humming, powered up remotely by Tessa. Eli ushered Mira up the ramp, firing at a group of pursuing guards. "Get us out of here, Tessa," he shouted as the ship's ramp sealed behind them. The Starfire roared to life, lifting off the docking platform and punching through the Hexalon's force field. Mira clung to a rail, her eyes wide as the station shrank behind them. In the safety of the ship's cabin, Mira slumped against the wall, her wings splayed out in exhaustion. Eli knelt beside her, his expression softening. "You're safe now," he said. She looked at him, her voice trembling as she spoke in her musical language. The translator device struggled to keep up, but one word came through clearly: "Thank you." Eli nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they had just done. The Hexalon would be on high alert, and the Zerothians would not take this lightly. But as he looked at Mira, free and alive, he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in a long while, Mira felt hope, not the fragile flicker she had held in her cage, but a blazing flame. She was free, and for the first time, the stars felt within her reach. The starfire cut through the endless black of space, its engines humming with a steady rhythm. Inside the ship's cockpit, Captain Eli Drake sat at the controls, his fingers dancing over the panels as he adjusted their course. Behind him, Mira stood near the viewport, her gaze fixed on the sea of stars that stretched out before them. For a moment, she simply stared, her wings catching the ambient glow of distant galaxies. It was the first time she had seen the stars without the oppressive barrier of glass. They seemed brighter, more alive, as if they were welcoming her back into the universe. Eli turned in his chair, watching her with quiet curiosity. "I take it you've missed this," he said, breaking the silence. Mira looked at him and nodded, her voice soft as she replied in her melodic language. The translator device interpreted, though its synthetic tone could not capture the full beauty of her words. "I had forgotten how vast it is." "How beautiful." Eli smiled faintly. "It's better when you're free to explore it." The journey to Solora, the sanctuary planet, would take several days. Eli explained that Solora was a haven for those displaced by war and conquest, a world protected by the United Galactic Alliance. Mira listened intently, her curiosity evident in the way her feathers flared subtly as he spoke. She had never heard of such a place, a planet where she might find peace and safety. During the voyage, Mira began to explore the starfire. Though the ship was modest, every corner was a new discovery for her. Eli watched as she marveled at the flickering lights of the navigation console and the hum of the engines. For someone who had spent years confined to a cage, even the small freedoms of the ship were exhilarating. Eli found her one evening in the cargo hold, her wings spread wide as she practiced gliding between the storage crates. She stumbled slightly as she landed, clearly out of practice, but the joy on her face was undeniable. "You're getting the hang of it," Eli said, leaning against the doorway. Mira turned to him, a playful glint in her eyes. She gestured to the open space around her, her words trilling musically. The translator caught her meaning. "It's not the skies of my home, but it will do for now." Eli nodded, his expression somber. "I wish I could take you back there. To your home." Myra's feathers drooped slightly, and she lowered her gaze. "There is no home," she said through the translator. "The Zerothians burned it all." Eli felt a pang of guilt, though he knew it wasn't his fault. He had seen the devastation wrought by the Zerothians in other parts of the galaxy, but hearing it from Mira made it personal. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "Then we'll find you a new one." The starfire approached Solora, its green and blue surface coming into view through the viewport. Myra's breath caught as she saw the planet for the first time. It was lush, vibrant, and alive, so unlike the cold, sterile halls of the Hexalon. As they descended through the atmosphere, the ship's sensors picked up transmissions from the sanctuary's central hub. Tessa handled the communications, securing clearance for their landing. The ship touched down gently on a wide clearing surrounded by towering, crystalline trees that shimmered in the sunlight. Eli and Mira stepped out onto the soft grass. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and fresh rain. Mira spread her wings instinctively, letting the breeze ruffle her feathers. For the first time in years, she felt the earth beneath her feet, the sun on her skin. They were greeted by a group of sanctuary representatives, an assortment of species from across the galaxy, each offering a warm welcome. One of them, a tall humanoid with silver skin, approached Mira and bowed slightly. "Welcome," they said, their voice resonant and kind. "You are safe here." Mira hesitated, looking to Eli for reassurance. He nodded, giving her an encouraging smile. This is your chance, Mira. A new start. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. The representatives led her toward the settlement, where others like her refugees, survivors, and wanderers had found solace. She turned back once, her eyes meeting Eli's. Will you stay? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Eli shook his head. I can't. The Alliance needs me elsewhere. But if you ever need me, you know where to find me. Mira nodded, though her feathers drooped slightly in sadness. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. For everything. Eli watched as she disappeared into the sanctuary, her luminous wings catching the light one last time before she was swallowed by the vibrant foliage. As the starfire lifted off, Eli couldn't help but feel a pang of loss. But it was outweighed by a sense of fulfillment. Mira was free, and her journey was just beginning. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the galaxy, she would find her place a new home, a new purpose. And as the stars stretched out before him, Eli smiled to himself. He had no doubt that Mira would soar again, higher and brighter than ever before.